Right. Good afternoon, everybody. I think we can kick off with the day's proceedings. Welcome to the Medical Device Code Forum. A big thank you to Caroline, as always, for putting this together. A lot of hard work and effort goes into this. I just need to you to note the meeting is being recorded, and you consent thereto by participating. And the meeting is held with no intent to collude or engage in any matter that might contravene competition law. Conflicts of interest must be declared, and if required, members recuse themselves either before or during the meeting as and when they become apparent. So as I say, welcome to you all. I'm Rob Miller. I'm the chairperson of the Code Committee and a board member of SAMED. I'd just like to ask you, if you don't mind, please to remain on mute with your cameras off. You can use the chat function if you wish to pose questions in the course of the presentations. We do have time at the end for Q&A, and we'll take as many of the questions as we can at the end. We've recently revised the online code test. There was a bit of a gremlin in as much as we required, or for a short period, it was required of participants to answer all questions as opposed to randomly selected questions. So my apologies to you, those of you who laboriously spent probably 3 or 4 hours going through all those questions, but well done to those of you who have passed. You don't have to retake the test. That's the good news. However, we do need to urge all members all companies who have customer-facing members, please to ensure that those employees who are customer-facing do complete the online test and certification by the end of March. That's the deadline that has been set. And still a good five or so weeks to go. The purpose of the session this afternoon is really to do a recap on the pertinent aspects of the code as it affects us in our day-to-day business and interaction with healthcare professionals. It was not intended in any way to substitute for your in-house training, where your compliance officers ensure that you are up to date and up to speed with all the aspects of the code. I certainly hope that you're going to learn a lot from today's session. I see we have a fairly strong number of participants. So thank you for all of you taking your time. So I think let's just get straight into it. I'll kick off with a few aspects. I will introduce the other presenters from the Code Committee as we go along. Thanks, Caroline. The purpose and the principles of the code, we have these 5 underlying principles that sort of drive the creation of the code, and they fairly critical in that we need to understand exactly what they mean. The principle of image and perception, for example, deals with what is the perception that we as an industry and our healthcare professional customers, what image do we project when we are seen in our dealings with our market. Now, by this I mean, for example, a bad example would be, a congress or conference that's been held at the Oyster Box in Durban, and everybody drinking and eating and surfing and off to play golf, etc., etc. It obviously creates a totally unprofessional image in the minds of the public, and believe you me, in this day and age of corruption and undue inducements, if I could call it that, the image that we project out there is extremely important. The principle of separation deals with the best interests of the patient. In other words, the code strives to separate any any undue influence that may be brought to bear on a healthcare professional in deciding what is the best clinical process or outcome for the patient. So the main intent here is not to provide any sort of inducement to a healthcare professional to use, prescribe, or otherwise support your products. Transparency deals primarily with the principle of law, where we do at all times comply with all laws, both international and local, that govern our day-to-day business practice. Equivalence is in terms of us as an industry dealing with healthcare professionals in an equitable manner, in as much as if you do utilize the services of a healthcare professional, you need to be sure that you are paying them what we term in the code fair market value. There's been a lot of debate around the definition of fair market value, and understand that we as SAMED and custodians of the code are not by competition law allowed to set any values, but you need to understand what the definitions are of fair market value in terms of compensating any of your healthcare professionals who may, for example, do a study for you or do a presentation at one of your in-house conferences, etc., and that you ensure that all healthcare professionals are dealt with in an equal manner there. And then finally, the principle of documentation, I think that speaks to itself. Any dealings that you have with healthcare professionals should be documented. And if it's a, sort of a long-term study that they're undertaking, whatever, it is best to have this all reduced to writing and in fact, a proper contract of service or service level agreement on record, so that there's no aspersions that can be cast on the relationship that you have with those healthcare professionals. Thanks. So the interaction with healthcare professionals, I think it's indispensable, as we say, to good patient care and progressive practice. I think we've touched on that in terms of the principle of separation. There's a possible risk of manipulation that needs to be avoided at all times. And we talk often about the blush test or the carte blanche test. Is what you're doing in terms of your interactions with the healthcare professionals going to stand up to scrutiny by any outside entity or party? Quite often we do have cases where companies are inclined to push the envelope a little bit. We're going to do a conference, but we'll throw in a nice little gift pack for the wives and a trip to the spa for the wives, etc. This should be avoided at all times. This is what basically is meant by, in terms of manipulation or the offering of undue incentives. And then clear rules and sanctions are essential. The code, with its guidelines, etc., is I think very specific. We need to understand this is a living document, and the code is and the various aspects to it is reviewed from time to time, and we in fact about to embark on a full review again. But the rules I think are very clear, and at times if you as companies are not too sure of the interpretation, we do offer an advisory service, which is a non-legal binding service, but we do give opinions in terms of any aspect where you feel you're not quite sure in terms of how to apply the rules. So why the code? We reiterate, it's all about the patient, safeguarding rather the patient, understanding that historically the healthcare sector has been, it was rife where undue inducements, and I keep using those words, or backhanders if you want to be more blunt or crude about it, were given to healthcare professionals in order to get them to prescribe or use or recommend your products. And this clearly is not in the best interest of the patients. You know, take an example, for example, you know, in the orthopedic arena, there may be a new hip or a hip that has been developed locally, which is a little bit iffy and so on. But, you know, because we're offering you an extra 5,000 Rand to implant the hip, doctor, you know, you go ahead and go crazy on it. It's sad to say, but there are still, I'm not going to say some cases where this still happens, and I'm not singling out the orthopedic fraternity by any means. We are obviously acutely aware of the undue practices that have taken place recently in terms of PPE and the COVID, etc. But yeah, it's essential that the healthcare professionals at all times apply their clinical judgment that there's no financial inducement in terms of providing that product to the patient. We draw ethical lines. We give effect to, obviously, the legislation. The Healthcare Profession Council of South Africa, they have regulations that govern the activities of their members, i.e. the healthcare professionals. And I think, as we've said, the code certainly provides clear guidance on where the line lies in each set of the circumstances. Now, who is governed by the code? Sometimes this question comes up in the certification process, and people seem to think that the code is there to govern all healthcare professionals, healthcare organizations, etc. That's not the case. The parties that are governed by the code are us, the industry, the members of industry, in terms of their activities and in terms of their interactions with healthcare professionals. And the healthcare professionals, by definition, please bear in mind, includes your procurement officers, nurses, doctors, etc., etc. It is not restricted just to one-on-one with doctors per se. So, you know, understand and know the definition of a healthcare professional. So who's impacted by the code is, of course, the healthcare professionals, the societies, the healthcare providers, that is the hospital groups, your healthcare funders, the discoveries and Medicare, yeah, the other one. You guys know who I'm talking about, the big funders, etc. Procurement personnel, and even to some extent the patients. So the actual governing of our practice and our business ethics, as it were, is directed at the industry, and on the other side, it does impact on the customers that we deal with. I think that's me. Oh, sorry, I wanted to add in just a brief feedback in terms of the progress, in terms of the recognition of the code. You know, we are long criticized for the fact that the code does not impact everybody in the industry. It only, at this point in time, impacts signatories to the code. We are in the process with a project called 18C in collaboration with the Marketing Code Authority, which is the pharmaceutical side of our industry, and together with others, in trying to get recognition of the code. We have pled or are pleading for a meeting with the Minister of Health. We recently had discussions with Dr. Nicholas Crisp, who, as you may well know, now is the Deputy Director General of NHI. He's been removed from driving the vaccine program, so he's back focusing on that. And certainly he has come out in support of this project. So hopefully in the course of next months and the course of this year, we hope to make some progress whereby the code will be recognized in the regulations and therefore be applicable, or the codes, will be applicable to all members, or not all members, but all companies who participate in the supply space of medtech products. Thank you. I'd now like to, if I may, just introduce Elvie Spearpoint. Elvie is the Vice Chair of the Code Committee, and she's going to speak to us on general criteria for events. Thank you, Elvie, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Rob, and welcome to everyone on the call. So part 1 of the code addresses our interactions with healthcare professionals. And as you know, the direct sponsorship of HCPs to attend third-party educational events is still prohibited. Instead, we support education through managed and appropriately documented grants that are channeled through professional conference organizers, professional societies and associations. And we do have limited time, so I'm going to briefly review the guidelines offered by the code in terms of the general criteria for events. So first of all, in terms of the program, ideally, I think it is expected, all events must have a clear and compliant purpose that is evident and very clearly defined in the program. It's generally best practice to indicate a definite start and an end time on the program. And I think it's just important to reiterate that every session that you plan to have, every activity that's taking place during that event should be indicated on the program. In terms of location and value, I think I will connect here with Rob's comment on the principle around image and perception. In the choice of location and venue, we have to consider the perceived image of that location and the venue with the media or with the public. It should not be perceived as luxury. It should not be specifically tourist or holiday focused, and it should not be perceived as an entertainment location or venue. In terms of venue selections, the code is not going to provide you with a list of approved venues. The onus is on the member company to apply the principles and review the guidance to determine the appropriateness of the location or venue that they are considering. If we can move on, please, Caroline. In terms of guests, it's definitely not appropriate to invite guests of healthcare professionals, whether it's a spouse or a family member, to a company organized event or to a product training event. It really doesn't make sense. It's not logical, and it would most certainly not create the right perception. So companies are not permitted to pay for any meals, travel, accommodation, or other expenses related to the guests or spouses of healthcare professionals. Looking at CPD meetings, important to note that no product promotion is allowed in the CPD meeting room. Company branded items or promotional items are permitted as long as it's not in that CPD meeting room. Speakers should, as far as possible, refrain from using any brand names during their presentations or their training sessions. And companies must make it known to speakers that the use of trade names in order to promote a particular product is definitely not permitted. In terms of hospitality, we may provide reasonable hospitality to healthcare professionals in the context of company events and third-party organized educational events, but the hospitality must not become the focus of the event. It must also not detract from the purpose of that educational event. As a general guideline, reasonable should be interpreted as the appropriate standard for the given location and must comply with obviously the national laws or regulations and professional codes of conduct. Also, the term hospitality can include meals and accommodation, and it's important to differentiate what is between what is reasonable hospitality and what is considered entertainment, as we obviously cannot pay for or sponsor any entertainment activities. Accommodation or other services provided to healthcare professionals should not cover a period longer than the stay or a period of stay longer than the actual program indicates for the event. In terms of travel, there's quite a lot to be said. The code provides clear guidance on travel arrangements that may be sponsored. All travel must align with legitimate, compliant company activities. And travel provided to healthcare professionals should not cover a period beyond what is indicated on the program. We do have a little bit of room for leniency in terms of situations where perhaps the flight routings are problematic, or there are limited flights or limited accommodation options available. So we allow for travel in the sense that delegates or attendees can arrive no more than 24 hours before the start of the event, and the expectation is that they would then depart within 24 hours of the event ending. It's best practice to look at the first available and practical flight out from the location. But again, like I said, where there are problematic or complicated routes, it would then have to move to the next level where it would be the first available flight out of that particular location. Business class airfares may not be exchanged for 2 economy tickets so that a companion or spouse can accompany the healthcare professional. And there are also very specific requirements or instances when a business class ticket can be provided, and the code covers that. First class is never appropriate. Premium economy flights may be considered if it's an international, very long haul flight. But again, the perception and cost are important factors when deciding whether premium economy may be acceptable. For any other travel, economy class is the standard class of travel that companies should offer healthcare professionals, whether that is to attend their own product training events or if it is through grant sponsorship to attend Congress events. If we can go to the next slide, please, Caroline. On satellite symposia, it is permitted to purchase satellite symposia packages at third-party conferences, and member companies may provide presentations on subjects that are consistent with the overall conference content. In these cases, member companies may determine the content of these satellite symposia, and they can be responsible for speaker selection. Then looking at transparency, it is very important that when companies sponsor events, that they are transparent and that the documentation and papers relating to the meetings reflect that sponsorship. The declaration of sponsorship must be sufficiently prominent to ensure that readers are always aware of it at the outset. I think transparency in all our dealings, it goes without saying, is vital. Comes back to the principles that the code is based on, and we should also always consider the blush test that we refer to quite often. We need to be comfortable that if our interactions or our association with events or healthcare professionals, if that information should become public, are we in a position to comfortably, ethically, and legally defend those interactions? Next slide, please. Third-party organized procedure training. So companies can support these events either through a grant or through direct sponsorship to cover the cost of attendance. The event must, however, fulfill the very specific criteria to be considered as procedure training, as opposed to a third-party educational event, which is mostly focused on theoretical sessions. Where third-party events are theoretical in nature, procedure training events consists of practical sessions and hands-on sessions, and the requirement is that those practical hands-on sessions should make up at least 50% of the program. So during these events, if the program includes observation of live surgery, The observation sessions must immediately be followed by a related hands-on session. Otherwise, that observation session will be deemed theoretical and it will not contribute to the portion of the program that is hands-on practical sessions. I think I need to hand over to Oriana now.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Avi. And I think, sorry, Oriana, I think, yeah, as we hand over from one presenter to the other and back again, perhaps if you could introduce yourself, it'll make it a little bit easier. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I was struggling to find my unmute button, but I'm Ariane Chetty, and I'm actually the legal counsel for Striker South Africa, obviously presenting as a member of the SAMED Code Committee today. So I'm going to be taking you through Chapter 2 of the code, which deals with company events. Company events in general, some of our general principles, and then specifically 2 types of company events, which are product and procedure training and education events, and then sales, promotional, product launch, and other business meetings, both of which companies can invite HCPs to. I think LV covered a lot of the groundwork, so I simply have to say that in general, company events should comply with the principles mentioned in our Chapter 1, which is our general criteria for events. But essentially, where there's a legitimate business purpose, company events may include, or it may take place at a member company's premises or manufacturing plant, or a healthcare organization that's used by the member company as a reference center. And then maybe if we can just move on to the next slide, which deals with product and procedure training and educational events. I think to all of us, patient care is of the utmost importance. And so naturally, in order to facilitate the safe and effective use of medical technologies, therapies, or services, member companies should make product training and procedure training available to relevant healthcare professionals. Importantly, the personnel that are actually conducting the product and procedure training must have the appropriate expertise to, of course, conduct that training. And then moving on to sales, promotional, product launch, and other business meetings, where it's appropriate, member companies can organize these events where the objective is to discuss the product-related services, features, benefits, conduct contract negotiations, or discuss sale terms. But when it comes to these meetings, in addition to the principles laid out in this chapter and Chapter 1, which are your general principles, it should also follow the more stringent requirement that, as a general rule, they should occur close to the HCP's place of business. So on that, I think, both types of meetings are important. They're essential for the growth of business and the advancement of knowledge and the use of our technology. The criteria is really reasonable criteria to comply with when hosting events. Moving on to virtual events, I think this is another advancement in our world as we now know it, really to ensure that our industry and the advancements don't remain stagnant, that we're able to access information when we can't be face-to-face. Again, all the principles laid out that relate to general criteria, as well as the requirements for company events apply to virtual events, both company and third-party virtual events. And maybe just to clarify what exactly virtual events is defined as, these are events that consist of virtual exhibitions, presentations, panel discussions, or live clinical procedures. And their broadcasting is to an audience which is not physically in attendance. Which is slightly different to a hybrid event where you have a mix of speakers and HCPs attending either physically or virtually as well. Moving on, when it comes to virtual meetings now becoming a norm, the code now considers what's appropriate under the circumstance when it comes to meals as well. Meals to healthcare professionals at their hospitals or clinic during events can only be provided when certain conditions are met. These conditions are highlighted on the slide. So just generally to cover them, meal delivery can be arranged for delivery at an invited HCP's place of business, bearing in mind that the actual event, excluding the meal time, has to be a minimum of 2 hours in duration. And providing meals is also limited to a group of HCPs being no less than 3 HCPs. Also, in order for us to kind of keep track of what's happening in a virtual world, HCPs must also confirm their attendance before the event, and member companies must be able to track that attendance to make sure that only appropriate recipients are receiving the actual meals. Again, only meal delivery is permitted. Cash vouchers or cash equivalents are not. And circling back to, tied into our first requirement, providing meals and refreshments at an HCP's home is considered definitely inappropriate. Then last but not least, an important thing to remember is, despite the nature of an event being virtual, continuing medical education is only allowed during non-CME slots. So, just to reiterate, in cases where slots are earmarked for advertising purposes or for lunch or comfort breaks, this is when you're allowed to do commercial promotion. So I think I've spoken enough on these 2 chapters, and I'm going to hand over to Sada.
Thanks, Ariane. I hope everyone can hear me. I've had some technical issues just before joining, so I hope everyone can actually hear me and there's no echo or background. So really, I'm going to do probably, I'd like to say, the easiest part of the code because it's just so straightforward. It's promotional items of medical utility, gifts and competitions, right? So really what we will just cover is general principles, promotional items of medical utility, gifts, other interactions, as well as competitions. The next slide, please, Caroline. Thanks. So really the general principle in terms of this sort of section or chapter in the code is really the perception, right? So there should be no personal enrichment of HCPs or any healthcare professionals. And it really shouldn't, no gift or benefit or any rebate or discount should really be given, as an inducement to prescribe, lease, loan or supply, stock, dispense, administer or buy any medical device, right? And that's really the overarching principle in this. And it's something we need to just take into account. Really when going into this. So the first one is really a promotional item, and right, this is just a promotional reminder, and it needs to be branded. So if you can move to the next slide, Caroline. So promotional items for HCPs really should of course be within the cost limits set from time to time, and that's really within the code. Currently it's 300 Rand per HCP. What's important to remember is that this should be a branded item, right? It should benefit the patient, be relevant to the practice, be educational, and of scientific value. It should not be cash or cash equivalents. We should not see vouchers here. We should not see CDs or anything of entertainment. And really, it's about reminding the HCP about your brand, and that educational aspect as well. So if you move on to the next one, please. Then there's items of medical utility, and this is permitted. It has to have a genuine educational function. So this really is about the benefit to the patient, right? So when you think about this item of medical utility, an example would, and normally this is what it is, a scientific journal or a subscription to a scientific journal, an anatomical model, so showing the patient how, for example, the knee would fit into, the actual part of your knee. As you can see, I'm not a medical background, but, an anatomical model. And we have obviously limits to that as well, right? So, something that's not a journal, a scientific journal, it's 300 Rand per HCP per year. Or if it's a subscription to a journal, and it's 2,000 Rand per HCP per year, and then it's 5,000 Rand for an anatomical model, right? Then there's something that would be seen as gifts, right? So this would be for cultural, religious, and national events. The code is very strict on this. They are completely prohibited. We cannot be giving gifts to HCPs that pertain to any of these religious or national events. And it's important to remember, it's all about perception. Why would we be giving a gift to an HCP for Christmas or Easter or, their 25th anniversary, etc. So that's really why this is prohibited within the code. Okay, you can move on to next. Other interactions that would be, prohibited is something, for example, payments may not be made to doctors or groups of HCPs, right? Directly to doctors or groups of HCPs, either directly or indirectly for the rental for their rooms or any other services, right? That wouldn't be deemed like a, acceptable service, such as a fee-for-service arrangement with an HCP or interaction with as an HCP as a consultant. That would be permissible, but other services that we would, possibly get would not be permissible. All right, so please move on. Competitions. So it's important to know that we can do competitions with HCPs, but it needs to have very strict parameters. So it needs to be based on medical or product knowledge. Individual prizes or educational items offered should benefit the patient or practice, right? Prizes cannot comprise of cash or cash equivalent. Entry must not, of course, be dependent upon prescribing, ordering, or recommending a product. And obviously, no cash or cash equivalents are allowed for the completion of a survey or as a prize for a competition. And also, as of 2018, when we banned direct sponsorship, a prize cannot be a sponsorship to a conference. That would not be allowed at all. Okay. Then I'm also going to be covering charitable donations in chapter 4. So, of course, charitable donations, the definition, if you mind, just thank you. It's really, the provision of cash, equipment, company product, or relevant third-party product, exclusive use, benefit, or for a charitable or philanthropic reason. It has to be to a bona fide charity or other non-profit entities with genuine charitable or philanthropic purposes. And if it's made on unrestricted bias, not contingent, of course, as always, not contingent on the purchase, lease, recommendation, prescription, use, supply, or procurement of a product or service, right? It's permitted if the purpose is supporting healthcare or research. It has to be documented, and it cannot be paid directly to HCPs or healthcare administration staff. Of course, what is really recommended that you implement if you are going to do charitable donations. It's recommended that you implement an independent decision-making review process to identify, prevent, and mitigate against potential bribery and corruption risks, right? It also needs to be recorded with and approved. And obviously, we recommend that you actually make the info publicly available. And this is really, there should be agreements in place, etc. So now I'm actually going to hand over. That's me done. Quick and simple. I'm going to hand over to, I think, Amanda to take us through arrangements with consultants. Thanks so much.
Take myself off mute. Good afternoon, everybody. I've got several chapters this afternoon, and the first one is chapter 6, which is arrangements with consultants. We're going to be running through the general principles. What is a genuine relationship in terms of consultancy? What is fair market value, which Rob touched on earlier, all about payments, and then disclosure and transparency. Next slide, please. So what we're effectively trying to do in terms of our arrangements with consultants is make sure that they are genuine, arm's length, and fairly reimbursed for the value that the consultant actually brings to the arrangement. So in this respect, when we're looking at what member companies can and can't do, member companies can engage consultants for their business, but it's got to be for a genuine reason. And then when we pay them for those services, it's got to be at a fair market value for the services that are being performed for the member company. What member companies may not do is make any arrangements with consultants that are then provided on either the business or the potential for the business, the future even business that the consultant may bring to the company. So there really has to be a distinct separation between the consultancy agreement and any business interests that the company may have in terms of that particular healthcare professional as well. Next slide, please, Caroline. So what we're looking at now is a range of criteria for determining whether your consultancy arrangement is genuine. And what we're really looking at here is there a genuine business need for the services that the consultant can actually bring to your business. That the number of consultants that you have on consultancy arrangement is necessary and not more than is reasonably necessary. That there are selection criteria in place in terms of, number one, identifying the business need that needs that consultancy arrangement, and then looking at the relevance of your consultant's qualifications, expertise and experience, and making sure that everything is aligned. Down to the second row, consulting arrangements have to be documented. So everything needs to go down in a written agreement, and that written agreement must be signed in advance of the consultancy arrangement actually kicking off. There shouldn't be seen to be any inducement to purchase, lease, recommend, prescribe, use, supply or buy any of your products or services. And the remuneration that is paid by the member company to the consultant must be reasonable and reflect the fair market value of the service that the healthcare professional is providing, the consultant is providing to your business. And that's not necessarily what they do in their day-to-day job. Member companies must maintain records of the services that are actually provided by the consultant, and the venue and any other arrangements for meetings with the consultants must follow the rules that are out in Chapter 1 of the SAMED code. Next slide, please, Caroline. So what we're looking at when we're talking about fair market value is dealing at arm's length with any healthcare professional who is a consultant to our business, that we have to consider that we have an open and unrestricted market and that neither party is under any compulsion to buy or sell their products or services in lieu of the consultancy, and that both parties have reasonable knowledge of all the facts that they need to make a sensible decision. When it comes to determining the commercial reasonableness of a consultancy agreement, it should make sense if it was entered into by reasonable parties, and there should be no potential there. So if there's no potential at all, it would still make sense for the business need to determine the need for a consultancy arrangement. So a company may be paying a healthcare professional fair market value for a clinical study, but is that study actually necessary? Is there a purpose behind that study, or are we just asking healthcare professionals simply to use our products? Needs to be a genuine business need, and that's there in the last section. We need to assess our business needs as member companies and actually put that business need relative to the consultant that we bring on board. Is the number of healthcare professionals reasonable for the need that we actually have in the job at hand? And in terms of the agreement, assess what services will be provided and in what respect those consultants will be compensated. Next, please, Caroline. Thank you. So again, in terms of fair market value, we need to go through a valuation risk assessment. And there are possibilities for non-compliance here. And what we need to do is reduce them wherever we possibly can. So there is a higher risk for non-compliance if there's no formal processes in place when this is done on a wing and a prayer rather than with a formal process. And payment rates should not be based on anecdotal information. They should have something justifiable behind them. There shouldn't be any overcompensation in terms of the service, neither should there be undercompensation either. And there should always be documentation along the way. So these are all the risk points, and we can mitigate those risk points and reduce the potential for risk if we use independent appraisers. So that is certainly something to consider. That if we actually use accepted valuation approaches and where we apply logic and consistency as well and make sure that we are consistent across the board. Next slide, please. So in terms of again, we've got 3 slides on fair market value. If we're assessing fair market value for healthcare professionals and then running on to key opinion leaders who are really more senior in their field and giving us more senior advice, the compensation they earn in medical practice may not be directly comparable to the compensation for the service they are providing to the member company. So again, it's about having genuine business needs and making sure that the fair market value is aligned with the service they are providing to you as the member company, not necessarily what they are doing in their practice each day. And compensation should be based on an objective, like we said before, and consistent methodology, including specific requirements. You need to know what your needs are up front. What are the services that you require? What is the experience and expertise of your consultants? What are the time requirements that are going to be needed for this business requirement? Do they have any particular specialities? And what is the difference between a healthcare professional and a key opinion leader? Next slide, please, Caroline. So really, we are looking at, when we come to arrangements with consultants, that we need to look at the level of experience, expertise and credentials. Bear in mind that key opinion leaders may well have a greater than typical level of expertise and credentials than a regular doctor or nurse or healthcare professional. And is the skill set that is required rare or unique? And then next, when we're putting a valuation on these particular skills, we're looking at the actual speciality that the key opinion leader has, the unique expertise, experience and credentials, the responsibilities that you're going to be engaging that consultant to perform, the number of hours per year or per half year that they're actually going to be engaged. And then the valuation is specific to the individual consultant. Next slide, please, Caroline. When it comes to making payments, we have to comply with all applicable tax and legal requirements. So that is a must do. And the consulting agreement must detail the expenses that can be claimed by the consultant so that everything is clear. And as we said in the first slide, agreed up front before the consultancy arrangement actually takes place. Next one, please, Caroline. And finally, disclosure and transparency. So SAMED member companies need to apply with all applicable national laws, regulations, professional codes of conduct, requiring any publication or disclosure or approval in connection with their use of any healthcare professionals as consultants. And we need to stress those obligations on the consultant as well and make sure that the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed with regard to the healthcare professional in parallel. And I think that might be it, Caroline. Oh, yes, thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Amanda, for the previous slides. So I'll be touching on the demonstration products and samples. So I'll first run through a few definitions and then get to the requirements in this. So just the definition of a product sample, so or demonstration product at least, This means that it's either a single-use or multiple-use product which are provided free of charge by or on behalf of a member company to an HCO or healthcare organization or a healthcare professional who is equipped and qualified to use them. And these demos are supplied solely for the purpose of demonstrating safe and effective use and appropriate functionality of a product. And this is not intended for clinical use. So demos do not include the following, which are samples, evaluation products, products that are provided at no charge as part of a charitable donation or as part of a research or educational grant, and products provided at no additional charge that forms part of the overall purchase price in a commercial supply agreement. Next slide, please, Caroline. Then the evaluation products. So this is also either a single-use or multiple-use product or equipment that's provided free of charge to a healthcare institution by or on behalf of a member company for the purpose of obtaining defined evaluative user feedback over a defined period of use when used within the scope of their intended purpose. So evaluation products do not include demos, samples, products that's provided at no charge as part of a charitable donation or as part of a research or educational grant, and products that's provided at no additional charge that forms part of the overall purchase in a commercial supply agreement. Then samples. So sample means single-use or multiple-use products provided free of charge by or on behalf of a member company to a healthcare organization or a healthcare professional. And this is in order for them to familiarize themselves with the products in clinical use. So samples do not include demos, evaluation products, products provided at no charge, which forms part of a charitable donation, or that forms part of the educational grant or research, and products provided at no additional charge as part of the overall purchase price in a commercial supply agreement. Next slide, please. Thanks. So the general principles is that member companies may provide examples of products in the forms of mock-ups and may provide a reasonable number of samples, and companies shall in all cases maintain appropriate records. This is the accurate books and records piece here, and it must not improperly reward, induce, and or encourage HCPs or HCOs to purchase or recommend or prescribe the use of this product or services. Then chapter 8, which is our loan or placed equipment. So the general principles here is that there should be a contract between the member and the healthcare professional, which is subject to the following provisions. The consumables or cross-merchandise capital equipment in a manner which is defensible and fair. Consumables linked to capital equipment being financed by means of the purchase of the consumables, and of course in line with the National Credit Act provisions. Equipment agreement should of course always be in writing, and it should be in line with the HPCSA's booklet number 11 on the next slide. So this booklet provides us with guidance on the over-servicing, perverse incentives and related matters, and just focusing on one piece of this booklet is that the HCP shall own and use technological equipment if it forms an integral part of their scope of the profession and practice and has received appropriate training in using and managing such equipment. HCP shall not overuse the equipment for procedures, tests, and other applications that are not indicated scientific or based on evidence. This constitutes over-servicing, and this is prohibited. And the HCP shall not use technological equipment, healthcare products, or devices for profiteering, and must refrain from charging patients fees for the use of such products or devices that are not market related. Sorry, yeah, there we go. Then chapter 9, which is our bonusing, rebates, and incentive schemes. So the purpose here is to provide accurate, transparent, and responsible billing of information to HCPs, reimbursement authorities, and other payers. And such documentation should be in writing, and in cases of valid complaints should be available as per the complaints handling process in part 2, which Tanya will unpack a little bit later. So members are expected to follow the principles of accepting invoicing procedures as detailed in SAMED's policy on transparent invoicing. and no member may offer a bonus, free good, or other incentive scheme deemed to be perverse to an HCP in relation to an acquisition of goods and services in contravention of regulations issued in terms of the Medicines and Related Substances Act. Thanks. And then royalty arrangements. So members should enter into a royalty arrangement with an HCP only where the HCP is expected to make or has made a novel, significant, or innovative contribution to the development of a product. And it should always be properly documented in a written agreement. And the calculation of royalties should be based on factors that preserve the objectivity of the medical decision making and should avoid the potential for improper influence. And it should not be continued upon a requirement that the HCP purchase, order, or recommend the product or device, or if there is a requirement to market the product or medical device upon commercialization. Thank you, and I believe I hand back to Amanda.
Unmute, Amanda. You always forget that button.
Some people would call it a blessing, Rob. Anyway, back to the chapter 11, which is patient registries. Thank you, Caroline. Next slide. So what is a patient registry? And effectively, it's an organized system for collecting observational data. And we'll look at a defined population over which we're collecting that data. However, it has to have a scientific, clinical, or policy purpose. And so why would we set up a registry, a patient registry? The intention is usually to improve patient care and outcomes. So by recording what's happening at the moment, we can make improvements to all of that. We can understand the effects of the products, the facilities, the way the patients are actually treated over the full care cycle. We want to improve patient access, perhaps to new therapies, and by collecting data, we can provide information about why things should potentially change. And then what we're looking to do is obtain data to support perhaps coverage, reimbursement, and value analysis of our products. We're looking at the real world scenario. So rather than a more formal study where things are really put into more restrained categories, we're looking at a real world scenario when it comes to the safety and efficacy of products outside of randomized controlled trials or other formal clinical study designs. We want to reduce the pre and post we want to reduce the pre and post burdens for data collection by providing regulators with alternative methods. And again, back to a real world scenario. And we're also meeting regulatory requirements for post-market data collection. This aids in the assessment of effectiveness and safety as well across multiple products and therapies. It helps us to develop hypotheses for further evaluation in more controlled clinical trials, and it also aids in the development or assessment of care guidelines. So not just products, but also the way those products are used and applied. So when member companies are considering patient registries, the things that we must do is provide reasonable remuneration at fair market value for any healthcare professional that is providing information to registries. Our registries must have a scientific and healthcare policy merit. It must also relate to a legitimate and defensible project. We need to have proof along the line in terms of documentation, protocols, ethics committee approvals, and agreements. And we have to comply with any applicable laws, including but not limited to our Promotion of Access to Information Act, our National Health Act, the Health Professionals Act, and related guidelines, and also the Protection of Personal Information Act, not forgetting the Consumer Protection Act. What we're not allowed to do is disguise anything as promotion, be disguised promotion, has to go back again to genuine requirements and needs. And in this regard, we recommend that you look at the SAMED medical device registry principles and position, and that is in the addendums, which I know are being covered later. Chapter 12. Thank you, Caroline. This is now all about reimbursement for information and economic data that a member company may obtain. And this is economic data, marketing data, formularies, managed care, and similar fees. So you're allowed to actually pay for this information. However, there must be a written agreement detailing the exact nature and extent of the service or the information that you're paying for. The agreement made available, the agreement has to be actually exist, number one, and be able to be made available in case there's a complaint. The service or information that you are paying for must be legitimate and lawful, and known to be part of legitimate business. And finally, purchase of information and reimbursement data should never be a condition for the support of any member's product or service, shouldn't be linked in any way to sales value, volume targets or usage, etc. Thank you, Caroline. Chapter 13, we're whizzing on. These are false claims regarding reimbursement. So no member company should make any false claims about the reimbursement that they have on their products or services to any healthcare professional. And there are several laws in effect that impose liability on anyone who knowingly submits a false claim or record in order to actually obtain money or actually to retain money on which they're not actually entitled to. And a member or company that helps, encourages or causes someone to make a false claim for reimbursement can also be liable for that false claim. As such, member companies must not suggest any mechanisms for billing for medically unnecessary services or products, or engage in any fraudulent practice to achieve inappropriate reimbursement. Thank you, Caroline. And finally, chapter 14, healthcare representatives. So when we look at our healthcare representatives, we should always be making sure that our representatives receive adequate training, that their product training is consistent with the product's regulatory status and all of the information that's in the instructions for use leaflet, that any promotion is conducted in a professional manner, and that there's no disparaging of opposition products in particular. Our representatives should also have scientific knowledge of their products and actually be able to have a discussion with a healthcare professional on the basis of the science that actually is behind the product. And when they're providing information, that information should always be precise and complete and cover all aspects of the product or the service that is being provided. Next slide, please, Caroline. When it comes to healthcare professionals that are actually representatives that are in the theatre setting or the clinic setting, there are several additional requirements that we need to be particularly mindful. So these are the things that we need to do as member companies. Our representatives must be trained in terms of operating room and clinical environment protocols, and they must be certified on the CRISE programme, please. They must enter with permission from an appropriate facility person, that actually the patient needs to give consent in writing for a company representative to be present in the clinical setting or in theatre. The representative must wear appropriate attire, and they must only advise on technical aspects of the company's product, only on technical aspects, not in terms of the relevance, clinical relevance of the product. The representatives must not give clinical, diagnostic advice, surgical advice, or recommend any treatment. They must not use or apply company products. They mustn't deliver patient or medical care directly to a patient, even if they hold the appropriate certification or licenses. Because they're a company representative and they're on company time. They also mustn't have any contract with the service provider that actually they're in the clinical setting or the theatre as in their own time either. And then in this respect, we ask that you look at the SAMED protocol and particularly addendum 4 for how healthcare representatives should conduct themselves in an operating room and clinical environment. Thank you very much, Caroline.
Thanks, Oriane.
Thank you. So I'm going to take you through chapter 15 of the code, which is advertising and promotional material. It is one of the more lengthy chapters, so bear with me. I hope my voice is not too bad to listen to. But just going on to some general do's and don'ts when it comes to the code. The do's when advertising medical devices, of course, it has to be in accordance with laws and regulations. And very importantly, it must portray technology in accordance with approved uses and attributes of the technology itself. Some minimum requirements in accordance with legislation and SAPRA guidelines as well is that it must be provided in a clear and legible manner. It must be consistent with the most recently approved instructions for use. And an advertisement which contains 2 or more pages must not be false or misleading when each page is read in isolation. Also, very importantly, sorry, please hold on for me 1 second. Information or claims and comparisons that are used in promotional materials and activities must be accurate, balanced, fair, objective, and unambiguous, and they must be based on up-to-date information and an evaluation of all the evidence. Very importantly is that it must always uphold certain standards that respect HCPs and patients. Whether or not an advert or promotional material complies with these do's that we speak about, as with most consumer-facing communications, we would assess conformity based on how a reasonable person in that situation would receive that advert. There's also certain no-goes when it comes to advertising. So what we don't want to be doing is through our advertisements and promotions be suggesting that medical consultation or surgical operation is not necessary. We also don't want to be discouraging consumers from seeking medical advice. No company really should be involved in promotional schemes which are hazardous to the public or which could bring disrepute to the industry. And promotional material must not be misleading as to the nature of the product, its ingredients or indications, and it must encourage rational use of medical device by presenting it presenting it objectively and without exaggerating its properties. Material must be sufficiently complete to enable a recipient of that information to form their own value on or their own opinion on the value of the medical device. And then moving on to public risk. So I think that you can agree that one of the worst things you can do when you're unwell is to pull up trusty old Google and try and figure out what's wrong with you. And that's because you will probably scare yourself silly with all the possible conditions that come up that make you think that you're pretty much on your way out. And that's one thing that we definitely don't want happening when it comes to advertisements about our member companies' products. We want to ensure that information is accurate and within the legal frameworks, that it's not distorted in any way that scares a member of the public or causes them to purchase out of fear. We really must be so careful, not to abuse the trust or exploit the lack of knowledge that consumers have. We don't want consumers self-diagnosing or inappropriately treating potentially serious diseases either. We must ensure that when it comes to the public, we're spreading balanced and accurate information for that matter. And then moving on to advertising to healthcare professionals. Thank you. So I think when it comes to this slide really speaks for itself. When company representatives introduce a medical device to healthcare professionals for the first time, they should provide a copy of the latest instructions for use. On subsequent occasions, that can be made available on request. but first time around, it's a must. And naturally, any advertisement or promotional material should not offer any personal incentive to anyone on a retail level. So your pharmacy assistants, your clinic nurses, any non-healthcare professional, to almost incentivize them to recommend or supply health devices. Then we move on to claim substantiation. So if you recall our discussions around public risk and how important it is to provide accurate and substantiated information, this topic very much lends itself to those points. The code really seeks to ensure that any claims that are made pursuant to promotional material is capable of substantiation, unless it's contained in instructions for use that has already been approved by the relevant regulatory authority. Substantiation for any information, claim, or comparison, or any reference to unpublished data must be provided without undue delay, or it could very well be assumed that you're actually, or the party in question is unable to support the point of view that they're claiming. The code also makes provision for if the information that you need to substantiate is confidential in nature. So if it relates to trade secrets, sensitive commercial information, it can be assessed by an independent investigator or shared on terms that is acceptable to both parties. And then moving on to legality. So on the point of legality that's covered by the code, what we need to know here is where the basis of a complaint relates to a contravention of the law, there's a process in place to decide on whether it does in fact involve that contravention or not. And this may include a referral of the dispute to our ethics panel. The ethics panel, however, will not enforce laws or regulations, rightfully so, that falls on the relevant regulator. But there is a process in place for those situations. And then we move on to scientific information. So again, the recurring theme when it comes to advertisements and promotional material is to ensure that all information is accurate, balanced, and not misleading. And the same goes for any type of scientific information that's included. Scientific information must be clearly communicated and easily understood by the audience that's actually receiving that information. It's information that must identify the researcher and the sponsor. All references must be listed, and because it is in fact scientific information, independent experts may be called upon to verify these statements if and when necessary. And then moving on to market and scientific research. So market and market research, some kind of do's here. So market research must be conducted specifically for that purpose. It should clearly specify who it's sponsored by, if in fact it is sponsored. It must not be disguised as a promotion. It also must not contain or lead to disparaging comments about competitors or their products. When it comes to clinical trials, this also must have a legitimate scientific purpose and naturally must comply with South African legal requirements and guidelines as well. And then moving on to comparative advertising. So again, the recurring theme when it comes to comparative advertising, it must not be misleading. It must be in alignment with the law. Points of comparison should also be factual and reflect scientific evidence. So a comparison is only permitted in certain circumstances. So if it's not misleading or disparaging, it's permitted. If the comparison relates to devices for the same intended purpose, or if one or more of the same features are compared or similar features are compared, that's permitted. And in doing comparisons, it should not imply that the other device that's being compared is harmful or ineffectual in any way. When comparing one thing against the other, there should be clear distinctions as well between the trademarks, the proprietary names, and those distinguishing marks of a competitor, for example. And those marks of a competitor should not be discredited in any way either. And of course, if you're using trade names, any distinctive marks, this must be done with the written permission of the other party unless something in the law provides otherwise. Open-ended comparisons are also not something that's permitted. So moving on to endorsements and testimonials by healthcare professionals. When it comes to endorsements and testimonials by healthcare professionals, any recommendations must be substantiated and of course cannot be in exchange for financial gain. Any use of testimonials or any type of promotion by healthcare professionals must be within the scope of professional codes. They should be genuine, they should not be misleading, they should illustrate typical cases only. And importantly, these need to be really up-to-date testimonials, so it should not be older than 3 years old. And then moving on to non-promotional material. So first of all, what is non-promotional material? Simply put, it's any material that's issued by companies that relate to medical devices, but it's not intended for promotional purposes. So for example, corporate advertising, press releases, financial information to inform shareholders or the stock exchange, and these should be examined to ensure that it does not contravene any statutory requirements either. Maybe if we go back to non-promotional material, just a couple of things that's highlighted in the chapter, just to kind of summarize it. Often, if there's use of quotations, we must ensure that it contains the author's current view. Any scientific quotation must accurately reflect the intention of and the meaning of the author. If you're using public quotations, that must be with the permission of the speaker, unless you're referencing a public record. Reprints of journal articles also occur, but they must not be provided unsolicited to a healthcare professional unless they're on label and have been published in a peer-reviewed publication. And then reference to use by healthcare professionals in non-promotional materials. So if you're referring to an institution, a college, a hospital, those must be establishments that obviously genuinely exist. And then we can move on to artwork and visual representations. So artwork and visual representations are no different to any other type of advertising in the sense that it must conform to the principles of the code. Graphs and tables must be relevant first, but also clear, fair, and balanced in terms of the subject matter that they're dealing with. In general, adverts shouldn't include alarming, misleading, or improper visuals to represent changes in the human body. Images should never be out of context, and it also should not imply that it can be used to treat anything other than what the registration of the product actually provides for. As a control measure, especially because we want to be consuming up-to-date information, it's also important to include the date or a code that identifies when the material was drawn up, or at least when it was last revised. And then you're almost done with me, journal advertising. So when it comes to journal advertising, an advertisement which contains 2 or more pages must not be false or misleading when each page is read in isolation. An advertisement taking the form of a loose insert in a journal may not be larger than the journal itself. And advertisements in journals must not resemble editorial matter unless it's clearly identified as that or as a sponsored feature. And then last but not least, we move on to electronic media. So this is the promotion. So the promotion of medical devices and IVDs via digital or electronic media must conform with all aspects of the code. When it comes to digital and electronic communications, which is such a common method in this day and age, we must ensure that, number one, details of the sender or the person on whose behalf the communication is being sent is provided. And number two, there's a way to opt out of these communications or adverts on first contact and also on subsequent communications. The opt-out is definitely something that must be respected. The chapter also covers the use of internet links. So in the case of an advertisement included as part of independently produced information on the internet, the statement should be in the form of a direct link between the first page of the advert and minimum information. And then audiovisual material. So examples of this would be films, video recordings, sound bites, interactive data systems. When it comes to this, the minimum information required by legislation must be provided either by way of a document that's made available to the persons who are being shown the material, or by inclusion on the recording or the interactive data system itself, along with instructions for accessing information where need be. Now, I know that that was probably a lot to take in on this chapter of advertising, but this chapter has a running theme throughout, which is just to make sure that members are portraying accurate, balanced information to the public. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Tanya.
Thanks, Ariane. And just to add to that, please remember that in terms of the medical device regulations, you may not advertise a Class C or D medical device to the general public. So I'm going to deal with a section in the code that I think not many people necessarily have had experience with. And one of the criticisms that has been leveled towards SAMED in the past is that we don't have sufficient teeth to deal with enforcing the code and dealing with infringements of the code. So I'm hoping after you've heard this section, you'll think differently. This area is dealt with in part 2 of the code, dealing with infringements, and also part 4, which relates to a complaint form. Next slide, please, Caroline. So what is the overall goal of this procedure? It's really to ensure a complaint handling process that withstands robust scrutiny. It enjoys public confidence and member support. It is effective, lawful, and efficient, and not a cost burden for SAMED. The SAMED board will appoint an independent chairperson for a period as determined by the board, who will be the custodian of this process, ensuring that both the principles of administrative justice as well as the substance of the code are preserved and promoted whenever it comes to dealing with complaints in relation to the code. And that independent chairperson will be a legally qualified expert. Currently, the independent chairperson who has been appointed by the board is Michael Juden. Next slide. So what are the types of complaints, or in what format can complaints be lodged? There are 2 formats. One is a formal written complaint, which is not anonymous. And then there is another format, which is via our whistleblowing hotline. However, in both cases, very similar information is required in order for the complaint to progress and be adjudicated upon by the independent chairperson. Also, in both cases, no lodging fee is required and anyone can submit a complaint. A member of the public, a patient, a healthcare professional, a competitor, a non-SAMED member can submit a complaint. If you're going to submit a formal complaint, you would need to do so providing the information that is on a prescribed complaint form. And this form is on the SAMED website on the code page. And we do urge even whistleblowers to please complete that form, because we have found through experience that when we don't get sufficient information, particularly if it's a whistleblower, and we can't get hold of the whistleblower to get more information, it becomes very difficult to progress a complaint. So these are the things that you need to ensure you submit with the complaint as best possible. We need the name and details of the complainant. Obviously, this is for formal complaints where you're not anonymous. We need to know the company that employs the complainant. We need to know your field of business. Are you a manufacturer, distributor, doctor, private hospital, etc.? The name of the alleged infringing company, so who you're complaining against, which we call the respondent. The facts of the alleged infringement. So what happened? When did it happen? Where did it happen? How? Also the clauses of the code that the respondent has allegedly infringed, and any supporting evidence that you might have which substantiates your allegation that they have transgressed the code. So pictures, recordings, documents, anything that you can provide that will assist the independent chairperson to actually adjudicate the complaint. If you're going to be sending a formal complaint, you must please send the complaint form to the independent chairperson, and the following email addresses are in the current version of the code, and also that you copy codecomplaint@samed.org.za, because SAMED does keep a record of all complaints. Next slide. Mentioned previously is our hotline. This was established in 2019, and this is where people who wish to be anonymous or not anonymous or partially anonymous can actually lodge a complaint. It is managed by an independent party, being Deloitte, and available 24/7, 365 days of the year. It's easy to use. It's in 11 official languages. And although we do say that you should please try and report contraventions of the code, in reality, other matters have been reported via this hotline. And in fact, you'll see later on that we have referred some of those matters to relevant agencies or authorities to then investigate. Next slide, please, Caroline. Just by the way, we have a video that is on the SAMED code website, which explains the process in terms of the hotline. But very briefly, the whistleblower can contact the contact center. There is a telephone number, or you can email the contact center, and the email address is on the website. Deloitte then reviews or analyzes the complaint. They sanitize the report if need be, in the case that the whistleblower wishes to remain anonymous, so that no comeback or no one can actually identify who the whistleblower is. The report is then sent to the independent chair. The independent chair then uploads the report. Beg your pardon, the independent chair then reviews the report, and it might and then decides on the next steps with regards to that complaint, and I'll go through what those steps might be in a minute. And when the independent chair comes to a finding or a ruling, they upload that finding to the whistleblower platform, which then enables the whistleblower to actually come back and see what the outcome of that case was. So the whistleblower does need to call back. They are given a reference number, by the way, when they first call or send an email. It might also include that a hearing is conducted in terms of dealing with the complaint. And that's where it then ends. Next slide, please, Caroline. So that's the a snapshot of the or a screenshot of the hotline video as it appears on the SAMED website, and you can see the telephone number that you can dial and also the email address, as well as the complaint form. Next slide. So since August of 2019, we've had 15 cases received on the hotline. 9 of those cases, interestingly, have been referred to relevant authorities, and they've actually had nothing to do with the code, which is why they have been referred. But I do want to just make the point that even though the majority of cases have not been around the code, they certainly have been around very important matters, which we have then alerted the authorities to. 6 cases have been closed, and at the moment we have 0 active cases. Next slide, please, Caroline. So these are just some of the examples of the types of complaints that we've received via the hotline. For example, a complaint regarding tender irregularities. In that instance, the matter was referred to the Hawks and the SAPS to further investigate. Another one would be around, if you go to the next slide, please, Caroline, there was a case where the complaint was alleged that a company was reusing single-use devices. In that case, this was referred to the relevant authority, being SAPRA, to investigate. Just to share a complaint that was directly related to the code. This complaint was regarding comparative advertising. In that instance, the independent chairperson called for an ethics panel to assist in the adjudication of the complaint. The panel found that the respondent was in fact in contravention of the code, and the respondent appealed the ruling. The appeal came back and upheld the original verdict of the panel, and the transgressor has been told to remove all of the offending advertising from the market and fined 20,000 Rand. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go through all the details of the cases and outcomes, but these slides will be made available to the members. Next slide, please, Caroline. Okay, so just something important to note, please. Some of the hotline cases have had to be closed because we haven't had sufficient information to actually investigate or take the matter further. So if you are going to use the hotline, and we urge you to use the hotline if you know of any members that might be transgressing the code, please provide all the relevant details. Also, you must follow up on the progress of the complaint within 10 days of lodging, in case the independent chairperson requires further information in order to continue with the case. Because the independent chairperson looks at the report, and if there is insufficient information, he or she will actually upload a report requesting additional information. So it's very important that you as the whistleblower follow up on the case within 10 days of lodging. Also, if further information is required, the complainant must please furnish such information within 5 days. So if you get to the 10th day and you see, oh, there's more information that's required, you've called the whistleblowing hotline back, then you must please provide that additional information within 5 days, because there are certain timelines that need to be adhered to in this dealing with complaints within the code. Because if that further information is not provided, the complaint will be dismissed without an investigation. Also, if at any stage of the proceedings it is no longer possible or fair to continue to conduct the proceedings whilst the complainant remains anonymous, the independent chairperson will communicate this to the whistleblower via the whistleblower platform, and they will request whether he or she consents to their identity being revealed so that the complaint may be dealt with to completion. If the complainant elects not to disclose their identity, the independent chairperson will then decide on the further steps that are to be taken, including appointing an independent investigator and or referring the complaint to the investigator or forwarding a report to another authority, including SAPRA, the Health Professions Council of South Africa, the Nursing Council, the Pharmacy Council, essentially the regulatory or the authority that is the most relevant in that instance. Next slide, please, Caroline. Just some of the powers of the independent chair, and I want to reiterate the word independent. We recognize that it was quite important that SAMED itself be at an arm's length in terms of dealing with these complaints. Why? Because we are dealing with complaints between SAMED members. And so it really does need to be managed in the most professional manner by the appropriate legally qualified persons. And no one within SAMED should be involved in any way in relation to no one at the SAMED office should be involved in any way, and even the SAMED board, in adjudicating on a complaint. And that's why we felt it was important to appoint an independent chairperson who, if they need a panel of experts to support them, can then appoint individuals to sit on that panel. Just to reiterate that the members of that panel could come from the industry itself, but they would sign a declaration of confidentiality, and they would also need to sign that there is no potential conflict of interest in terms of dealing with that complaint. So what are the powers of the independent chairperson? Firstly, they can direct that the respondent file a written answer to the complaint and that the complainant reply to that written answer within a specified time frame. They can also direct that the matter be submitted to conciliation or mediation by a recognized organization. They can direct that the parties attempt to settle the matter within a specified time period, or that a hearing be held in order to hear and determine the complaint. They can also give the directions in terms of the manner in which the hearing is to be conducted. And they can also direct that a hearing be held before an ethics panel constituted by themselves. And they can appoint persons from SAMED's list of suitably qualified experts to the ethics panel. In terms of a ruling, the procedure in the code states that within 30 days of the conclusions of proceedings, the independent chairperson must issue written findings in relation to the complaint and his or her reasons for such findings. Next slide. So the independent chairperson or the ethics panel has the power to issue a sanction that is appropriate in the circumstances should the company be found to have been in contravention of the code and in accordance with sanctioning guidelines. These guidelines and everything that I've mentioned right now are all in the code, but the following factors are relevant in determining an appropriate sanction: the nature and the extent of the breach, including its impact on the market and the reputation of the industry as a whole, whether the breach should have been evident to the company, the length of time over which the breach took place, the number and type of alleged breaches, previous and or similar breaches of the code, the impact of the breach on competitors, patients, healthcare providers, and or the provision of healthcare services, the respondent's potential failure to implement previously imposed sanctions and or undertakings, the circumstances in which the breach occurred, and the potential costs to be incurred by a company in order to take corrective action. And in that regard, the independent chairperson will consider the overall cost of the sanctions, for example, the cost of issuing a corrective letter in combination with a potential fine. And the independent chairperson has to set out his or her reasons for imposing a sanction in the ruling. Next slide. So in the code, we have a table that looks at guidelines, and it gives the independent chair as well as the ethics panel some idea of what would potentially be a fine should a contravention be minor, moderate, or major. Next slide, please, Caroline. As well as if it is a very serious or severe breach and has an impact on patient safety, for example. Also, if fines that have been leveled previously have not been paid, there are additional sanctions that can be applied, and if corrective actions are not implemented. So you can see that some of those fines are quite substantial. I mean, if you just look at that last fine there, a further fine of 100,000 Rand that has to be paid within 60 working days. Next slide, please, Caroline. And I think we can continue to the next slide. Do you have a right to appeal? Yes, the procedure does allow for that. Both parties have a right to appeal a ruling within 21 days of it being issued. In this instance, the SAMED board will appoint an independent chairperson to hear the appeal. It will not be the same person that dealt with the initial complaint. However, there is a fee to lodge an appeal, and that fee is 40,000 Rand, of which 10,000 Rand is a non-refundable payment for administrative costs. And in the event that the appeal is successful, SAMED will refund 30,000 Rand to the appellant. What about costs? Each party, so the complainant and the respondent, obviously not in the case of an anonymous complainant. However, each party will pay their own costs. However, such costs may be claimed from the other party subject to any costs order as directed by the independent chairperson or the ethics panel who heard the complaint. Please note that member companies whose employees might be on the ethics panel are responsible for their own costs, for example, time off at work and to travel to the hearing. And importantly, this is quite a new addition to the code. If a party has been found to have contravened the code, such party shall be liable for all legal costs and disbursements, including but not limited to the costs of obtaining expert opinion, should it have been required. And payment shall be made within 30 days of demand. Next slide. So what about companies that do not belong to SAMED? And this was another criticism, that this code only is applicable to non-SAMED members. So how can we make sure that non-SAMED members abide by the code? We do not have jurisdiction over non-SAMED members because they haven't signed up to the code, they're not a member. So even though this might be the case, there is a clause in the code where it allows for the independent chairperson to nonetheless, if required, appoint an independent investigator to investigate the matter further and or refer the complaint or the report of the independent investigator to another authority, including SAPRA, HPCSA, etc., etc. So there are ways and means that even if a complaint is lodged against a non-SAMED member, if the independent chairperson feels that this is serious enough and there is a relevant authority that can deal with this matter, even the Hawks or SIU, the Presidential Anti-Corruption Forum, the independent chairperson will then pass it on. What are the powers of SAMED? In terms of the code, we may cancel or refuse membership to any company that is unwilling to commit to the standards and values reflected in the code and fails to conduct its affairs in a manner consistent with the code. Next slide, Caroline. Thank you. And I will now hand over to Albie.
Which brings me to part 3 of the code. This part of the code covers questions and answers. There are approximately 40 questions with their related answers that can very easily be consulted and cross-referenced to the chapters of the code that it relates to. The answers provided are in most cases very detailed, and where possible, other links or external sources are referenced and indicated. And this section is especially useful if a question comes up that is not specifically addressed elsewhere. And compliance officers can also use these questions in their internal training programs. Next slide, please, Caroline. And then the last part is section 5, part 5 of the code, that consists of various addendums and resources for companies and compliance officers. So I'm not going to discuss each one in depth. I'd like to just draw your attention to it so that you are aware that it's there and it can be used. Addendum 1 is a consulting agreement template, as well as various supporting articles that refer to topics like remuneration, scope of services, term and termination, and confidentiality. Obviously, these templates need to be tailored to the individual company's needs, but at least you know you're starting off with the minimum required minimum requirement in terms of the clauses. Addendum number 2 is the SAMED policy and procedure for transparent invoicing model. Addendum 3 is the medical device registry principles and position paper that SAMED supplied. And then addendum 4, as mentioned by Amanda under chapter 14, is the protocol for company representatives in an operating room or clinical environment. So this aligns with CRICE, but I also want to point out that the resources don't stop here. On the SAMED website, there is an extensive library that covers medtech regulations, market access, the code and compliance, transformation, national health insurance, POPI and PIA guidance. There's a separate section on COVID. So we urge companies and especially compliance officers to make use of these updated and free resources available to them. Thank you. I'm going to hand back to Rob.
Thanks, Ovi. I'm a little surprised that there are not a multitude of questions in the chat room, or you know, anybody, maybe if you'd like to raise an issue or make a comment, you're welcome to. I think what has been presented today is quite an in-depth overview of the code, but I think what it brings home to everybody is the fact that we're a highly regulated industry. And it's important to know that we're a self-regulated industry. Whilst we're looking for recognition of the codes from the authorities and in the regulations, etc., we wish to remain as a self-regulated entity. And that was the very reason why SAMED developed the Code of Business and Marketing Practice as far back as '94. We were one of the first medtech industry associations to do so. In fact, we started developing our code ahead of MedTech Europe and AgvaMed. And I think the critical overlying factor here is the reason we're so regulated is because we need, and I'll come back to those principles, we need that principle of separation where there is no quarter given for any sort of influence or undue influence in terms of clinical decisions which are taken in the patient's best interests. So if there aren't any questions, we're a little bit ahead of time, which you know, is always a good thing. I think it gives you. I do see a hand there. Who is that? Let's see. Can somebody help me there? Marie. Caroline, can you unmute Marie? Or Mari?
No, sorry, it was just by accident I pressed on it. I wanted to press on the chat. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you. Thank you. All right, guys. I think, you know, if you don't mind, if you could just rate the member forum or the code forum. Thank you for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. And please, 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 I appeal to you, please get your members or your company representatives, your member-facing individuals to complete the online certification. Tanya?
Rob, sorry,
Yeah.
just before we leave, I just wanted to make mention of the code advisory opinions. So that is another resource available to members. If you are unsure of a practice that, you know, or a marketing activity that you are planning, or just in general, you're unsure that what you're doing as an organization is in alignment with the code, you are more than welcome to request a code advisory opinion. You can be anonymous or not, but the code committee then reviews the query and they provide a non-binding, non-legal opinion. Those opinions, I think, are proving very valuable. We've received a good few in the last few years, and we do publish them. So Caroline publishes an updated document on the website. She usually refers to it in the SAMED news. So please do look out for that, because, you know, that really looks at real-time experiences and activities that sometimes members grapple with.
Great. Thank you, Tanya. Appreciate that reminder. Right. I think it just behoves me to wish you all a good Thursday afternoon, and look forward to Friday. Let's hope and pray that the matter in the Russian-Ukraine conflict doesn't escalate into something too tragic. And my thanks to everybody, and enjoy yourselves. Bye-bye.